Hi everybody, today we're going to talk about swaps. So what is a swap? So suppose you have a company A and they borrowed a huge amount of money N at interest rate 0.4%. Okay, so every time period they have to pay back an interest, sorry, not 0.4, 4.4%. Every time period they have to pay back an interest payment of 4%, and at the end, obviously they also have to pay back the notional amount. Okay, so now there's another company, company B, that also borrowed the same amount of money N, and they borrowed it at a floating interest rate, LIBOR plus 1.0. So this LIBOR is a changing interest rate depending on the market, so it's not fixed. And for example, in half a year, it could go up or down, and this would affect the payment. So if the interest rate goes up, then borrowing becomes more expensive. So now B has to make bigger payments. Okay, so company B doesn't like that. They do not like to be subjected to necessarily to market fluctuations, perhaps. So both companies are going to enter into a swap agreement. So A is going to agree to give, since they're sharing the same notional amount, A can agree to give B LIBOR every single time period. And B can agree to give a fixed interest rate R. So they've exchanged their demands placed by the institutions that they've governed. So A will now pay B's floating interest rate, and then B will pay A's fixed interest rate payments in some sense. Okay, not the exact payments, but at least in order to manage out the floating part of it. Okay, so again, why do we want to do this? Well, maybe A is maybe more okay with risk, or more likely, A might think that interest rates will go down, so it wants to take on a floating interest rates, because when interest rates go down, the payments become less for floating interest rates. So maybe A thinks that the interest rates will go down. Interest will go down. Okay. The second reason why two companies might enter into a swap agreement, actually, it might be actually beneficial for both of them. So let me give you an example. So suppose A borrows at, so it has two options. It can either borrow fixed at 4%, or it can borrow floating at LIBOR plus 0.3%. Okay? So then company B can borrow at 5.2%, and it can borrow at a floating rate of LIBOR plus 1.0%. So you can see company B is in both categories. It's less favorable for company B than company A to borrow. However, it turns out by entering into a swap agreement, actually both companies can benefit from a lower rate, which is kind of crazy. So let me draw you a picture. So here's our notional amount N, and here's A. And A is going to borrow, so it has a requirement to pay back its lender for 4% of the notional payment every single time period. So company A, okay, decides to pay B LIBOR, okay, and then company B over here gives A 3.95%, okay. Meanwhile, B entered, it borrowed at its LIBOR rate. So here's B's lending institution, and it borrowed at LIBOR plus 1.0%. Okay, so now how much is A paying? So A is paying every single time period. It's paying LIBOR to B, right? And then it's also paying 4%, right? Sorry, did I mess this up somewhere? And then it's getting, it's correct. And then it's getting 3.95% from B, right? So in total, this is how much A is paying every time period, 0.05%. Okay, so now B is paying 3.95% to A here. Then it's getting LIBOR from A, and then it's paying LIBOR to the bank plus 1%. So in total, 4.95%. So as you can see, as expected, B is not subject anymore to LIBOR because it gets its LIBOR demand from A, and it cancels out, right? Meanwhile, A does have to pay LIBOR to B. Okay, so if you check here, company A has if company A didn't enter into the swap agreement, it would have had to pay LIBOR plus 0.3%. Okay, but instead, by entering into the swap agreement, company A has actually succeeded in paying LIBOR plus 0.05%. Okay, company B, by entering into this agreement, paid 4.95%, but if it hadn't, it would have had to pay 5.2%. So you can see in this situation, somehow both companies have actually benefited from this trade. So slides don't go into this much detail, but I found it interesting to sort of think about the conditions in which this might be true. Okay, so here, instead of saying 4%, I'm going to write x1. Okay, and then here's B, and so A is going to pay B LIBOR, and then B is going to pay AR, and then B is going to pay its lender LIBOR plus, I'm going to say E2. So A can borrow at a fixed x1 or at a floating, just to make it abstract, LIBOR plus E1. Okay, and then B can borrow at x2 or a floating LIBOR plus E2. Okay, so now the hope is that this agreement has to be both favorable to A and B somehow. Okay, and I just want to find out what the conditions are for when this is actually true. So if A were not to enter into this agreement, okay, it would have to pay x1. Okay, sorry, no, it would have to pay. So this is the thing we have to compare to. Okay, it would have to pay LIBOR plus E1. Okay, because it wants to be subjected to the floating interest rate payment. Okay, so so this should be bigger than or equal to the amount that it has to pay if it were to enter into the agreement. So it enters into the agreement, therefore it pays LIBOR minus R here, plus x1. Okay, and from this we get that R is greater than or equal to x1 minus E1. Okay, so now we're going to do the same logic for B. So B, it enters, if it doesn't enter into a swap agreement, it has to pay x2 from here. Okay, but if it does enter into the swap agreement, then it pays LIBOR plus E2, then it also pays R, and then it doesn't pay LIBOR. I mean, it gets a LIBOR from A, so that's subtracted. So from this equation, we get that R is less than or equal to x2 minus E2. So putting them both together, we get that x1 minus E1 is less than or equal to x2 minus E2. So what I'm trying to say is, if this value here is less than or equal to this value, then so our R is in between here. If R is between these two values, okay, then there exists an interest rate R, that both A and B can agree to that benefits both of them. Okay, so this is a sliding range of values. Maybe it depends on how A and B communicate and decide on what R should be. So you could have something that benefits A a lot but B very little, or you could have something depending on which side of the scale. So, but if this is true, then you can come to an agreement. But if these aren't, if x1 minus e1 is greater than x2 minus e2, then it would be better for both A and B to borrow separately from, on its own terms rather than enter into the swap agreement. Just to go through the examples, x1 minus e1 from the example above was 4.0 minus 3%, so this is 3.7, okay, and then we have R in between here, and then we have x2 minus e2, which is I think it's 5.2 minus 1. So 5.2 minus 1, 4.2. So from this example, you can pick any r in this range. It'll be both beneficial to a and b. As soon as you step out of it, it's not worth for either a or b to enter into the swap. I mean, it might be very worth for a, for example, if you, for example, if a has to pay nothing, if r is 0, right, then a is very happy, right? Or sorry, if the b is very happy because r is 0, right? But a is not going to be happy. So this is a is bound and this is b is bound. Okay. All right. So finally, the last part of this lecture. So I think I wanted to talk about, suppose we have, so here's a notional amount n, and then we're just going to look at swaps in general, and we're going to look, I guess, at a fair swap, because as you can see here, depending on the value of r, right, it's either beneficial to a or b. So can we find a value of r that's fair that has the value to enter into the contract at time t equals 0 has value 0. So the expected value, or however you want to view it, or subject to arbitrage argument. So so here the value. So let's say company A is entering into the swap. Okay. So what is the value of the swap agreement? Okay. I guess in terms of future cash flows, because I think by linearity of cash flows, we can show, so we have two cash flows, and if the sum of the cash flows is whatever, greater than or equal to 0, then the price, or the price should be equal to the sum of the cash flows. Okay. Given the two cash flows. So what are the cash flows that A has to make? It has to pay LIBOR. It has to pay a floating rate, right? So that's N, right? So as we covered in a previous lecture, the value of a floating rate bond is exactly equal to the notional amount. So again, a floating rate bond is one where you pay RK minus 1 for all K, and then at the end, times N, sorry, so this is like this is a floating rate, right? So the last period rate times N, and then at the end you also pay N, okay? And the value of this cash flow is equal to N, okay? So now from this, you subtract off the cash flows that it receives from, the fixed one that it has to pay. So this is the floating rate, okay, floating. And then we have the fixed ones, okay? So for the fixed ones, right, it's minus, so we're getting fixed payments, right? So N, and then I'm going to use X. X is the decided upon interest rate R from here, okay? Multiplied by the discount from 0 to T. T equals 1 to T, okay? So now both N and X are constant, so we can take it out of here. And then we also need to subtract off the, so these are like interest payments, right? And then we also, a fixed rate bond, you also have to pay the notional amount at the end. And the amount that you have to pay for the notional amount, or the price associated with it, is N minus 1, and then the discount factor, 0 to big T, which is the maturity rate, okay? So both N and X are constants, so we can take it out. And then again, we want the value of entering into the swap agreement to be 0, okay? For it to be like a fair and balanced swap agreement, whatever that means. So we've taken the constant out. T equals 1 to T, D0 T minus N. Sorry, not there, not minus, there. I got confused. There, D0T, okay? N D0T. So now you can solve for X to find out what should be the interest rate X, such that the value of entering into this agreement is 0 at time 0, and you get whatever. It's like the n's cancel out, and I think you get 1 minus d0t over summation t equals 1 to t d0t. Okay, so if you pick this interest rate, and notice this does not depend on the notional amount at all. It just depends on the discount factors. Okay, so if you pick this interest rate, I think it's kind of weird that like the swap doesn't depend at all on the future, but I think we've gotten to this point by sort of arbitrage arguments where we priced a floating rate bond based on our ability to borrow and lend and then later pay back little chunks. So it's kind of weird, but this is the optimal interest rate. It does not depend on any of the floating rate. It doesn't depend on like the expectation of the future interest payments. Of course, if you know that the interest payments are going to be different, then I mean these things are going to change, right? The discount rates. If you know that interest rates are going to go up, then this will change. But at time zero, this is all like you can price it with all the information you have at time zero. So I guess one more thing that I wanted to talk about is I actually wanted to make sure that this x that we're borrowing at is actually does it actually make sense to enter into the swap agreement? Is it actually less than or equal to I guess the interest rate R, so which is D0. Well, I'm not exactly sure, but basically this sum right here, okay, is greater than or equal to, based on basically if you like each of these is d0t is greater than, okay, t, well, it's sort of complicated, but basically I think I was trying to also make sure that I understood that x is also, like, it's actually worth borrowing at interest rate at x. So assuming we know d0t, maybe it's better to just take my money and borrow instead from at this interest rate for this discount factor. But yeah, so I won't prove that here, but yeah. Okay, thanks.